The day you stop looking at people through the price of their shoes is the day you finally see who they really are. Few people knew that Ethan Walker had whispered those words to himself before walking away from a glass tower that carried his family name across the skyline of Chicago. At 34, he owned more companies than he could visit in a month, signed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars before lunch, and appeared on magazine covers beside headlines calling him the future of American business. Yet every smiling photograph hid the same quiet question that followed him home each night. If everything disappeared tomorrow, who would still choose to sit beside me? That question refused to leave him after another lavish charity gala where compliments seemed to chase his bank account instead of his heart. So before sunrise on a cool Monday morning, Ethan handed his phone to his chief of staff, locked away his custom watches, folded his tailored suits into garment bags, and disappeared without telling the media, his board, or even most of his closest executives. For 30 days, the billionaire would live like a man who had nothing. No luxury apartment, no private driver, no assistants solving every inconvenience before he noticed it. Only a worn backpack, a faded gray sweatshirt, secondhand jeans, and enough cash to survive like any ordinary American trying to make it through another week. By 8 o'clock, the wealthy businessman the world admired no longer existed. Sitting alone outside a neighborhood bakery on the north side of the city was simply a tired man with unshaven cheeks, weathered sneakers, and thoughtful blue eyes fixed on the sidewalk. The morning air carried the comforting smell of fresh cinnamon rolls, toasted bread, and dark roasted coffee as commuters hurried past with their phones in one hand and travel mugs in the other. Most never looked at him. A few looked just long enough to decide he was someone they did not need to notice. Ethan said nothing. Every pair of footsteps became another answer to the question he had carried for years. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the bakery door opened again. A young woman stepped outside, balancing 2 paper coffee cups against her arm while struggling to keep the wind from stealing the stack of pastry bags she carried. She looked no older than her late 20s, with light brown hair tied into a loose ponytail and flour dust still clinging to the sleeve of her navy apron. Her name tag read Claire. She caught one bag before it slipped to the sidewalk, laughed softly at herself, then noticed Ethan sitting alone on the bench across the street. Their eyes met for only a second before she continued delivering breakfast to waiting customers. Ethan lowered his gaze, expecting nothing more. He had already learned that people were experts at pretending not to see someone who looked like they had nowhere to be. 5 minutes later, footsteps returned. A warm paper cup appeared beside him, followed by a fresh blueberry muffin wrapped inside a small bakery bag. "I accidentally made 1 coffee too many," Claire said with an easy smile that asked for nothing in return. "It would be a shame to let it go cold." Ethan looked at the untouched breakfast, then back at her. "I don't have any money." Claire shrugged as though that detail carried no importance at all. "Good thing I wasn't selling it." Before he could answer, she pulled a black marker from her apron pocket, smiled to herself, and wrote a short sentence across the side of the paper bag before placing it gently into his hands. Ethan glanced down and read the neat handwriting. "Kindness feeds the soul before it feeds the body." For the first time in years, the billionaire who owned almost everything found himself holding something that money had never been able to buy. The coffee had long since cooled, but Ethan still found himself staring at the sentence written across the small paper bag, as though it carried an answer he had spent years searching for. Kindness feeds the soul before it feeds the body. He folded the bag with surprising care and slipped it inside the old notebook resting in his backpack. That notebook had once been intended for business ideas during his 30-day experiment, but now it held something far more valuable. It held proof that genuine compassion still existed. Across the street, Claire moved effortlessly behind the bakery counter, greeting every customer with the same patient smile, whether they ordered a single cookie or enough pastries for an office meeting. Ethan watched from a distance without realizing how quickly an hour disappeared. Nobody treated her job like it was glamorous, yet she carried herself with a quiet pride that could not be purchased. Around lunchtime, he finally walked inside, the small bell above the door chiming softly as warm air wrapped around him. The bakery smelled of butter, vanilla, and fresh bread, making the outside world seem colder than it really was. Claire looked up from arranging cinnamon rolls in the display case and recognized him immediately. Her smile appeared just as naturally as it had that morning. "I am glad you came in," she said. "How was the coffee?" Ethan hesitated for a heartbeat before answering honestly. "It was the best cup I have had in a very long time." She laughed, believing he meant the flavor. "That is good because I made it." Before Ethan could respond, an elderly customer struggled to carry 2 large pastry boxes toward the door. Claire excused herself without a second thought, hurried around the counter, and carried the boxes all the way to the man's car despite the growing line inside. She returned a minute later slightly out of breath, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear as though helping people was simply another item on her daily checklist. Ethan noticed something unusual. Every person who entered the bakery seemed to leave smiling, not because the pastries were perfect, but because Claire made each customer feel seen. She remembered names, asked about families, congratulated someone on a new job, and wished another customer luck before an important medical appointment. She gave away pieces of encouragement as freely as fresh bread. "Can I get you anything?" she asked. Ethan glanced at the menu even though he had already decided. "Whatever you recommend." Claire pointed toward a slice of warm apple pie. "That one never disappoints." She placed it on a ceramic plate instead of a disposable container and poured him a fresh cup of coffee. When he reached into his pocket, he counted only a few worn dollar bills, exactly as he had planned before beginning this experiment. Claire noticed immediately. "Do not worry about today," she said quietly. "You already paid me back." Ethan looked confused. "I do not remember doing that." She smiled toward the empty plate where the blueberry muffin had disappeared hours earlier. "You did. You ate. That is enough for me." Those simple words landed harder than any negotiation he had ever faced inside a corporate boardroom. For years he had measured value through numbers, percentages, quarterly reports, and market growth. Claire measured value by something entirely different. Whether another human being was a little less hungry than they had been an hour earlier. As the afternoon sunlight drifted across the front windows, Ethan noticed a handwritten sign taped beside the register. "Help yourself shelf. If you need bread today, please take one. If you can give tomorrow, please do." No questions asked. He stared at the shelf where fresh loaves rested beside small paper bags. Nobody watched to see who took one. Nobody demanded proof of hardship. It operated entirely on trust. Ethan found himself wondering how many businesses could survive if they believed in people instead of protecting themselves from them. Before leaving, Claire walked him to the door. "You know," she said with a thoughtful smile, "you do not have to sit outside every morning if you do not want to. We always need an extra pair of hands before opening. It is not much, but there is coffee, breakfast, and honest work." Ethan looked back at the little bakery, then at the woman who had unknowingly challenged everything he believed about success. He accepted with a quiet nod, never imagining that stepping through that door the next morning would begin changing far more than the outcome of his 30-day experiment. The next morning Ethan arrived before sunrise, surprised to find the lights already glowing inside the bakery while the rest of the street still slept beneath a pale blue sky. Through the front window, he watched Claire tying on her apron, humming softly as she arranged trays of fresh pastries that had just come out of the oven. The smell of warm bread drifted through the cracked back door, mixing with the cool morning air. When she noticed him waiting outside, she unlocked the door with an easy smile. "You are early," she said. Ethan glanced at the clock above the counter. "I did not want to be late on my first day." Claire laughed. "Then you are already doing better than half the people who have worked here." She handed him a clean apron with the bakery logo stitched across the front. "Welcome to the team." The words felt strangely meaningful. Nobody had welcomed Ethan anywhere in years without first mentioning his last name, his company, or his success. Here he was simply another pair of hands helping before breakfast. Claire showed him how to carry trays without burning himself, how to stack fresh loaves so they cooled evenly, and how to refill the coffee station before the first customers arrived. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, but balancing 6 blueberry muffins on a baking tray somehow required more concentration than he expected. Claire smiled every time he made a mistake, never laughing at him, only encouraging him to try again. "Perfection is overrated," she said while straightening a crooked row of cookies. "People remember how you make them feel long after they forget whether the pastry looked perfect." Ethan quietly repeated those words to himself. They sounded simple, yet they challenged everything he had built his career around. As the morning rush filled the bakery, Ethan began noticing something he had missed the day before. Before handing every customer their order, Claire always reached for a black marker resting beside the register. On every paper bag, she wrote a different handwritten sentence. One customer received, "You are stronger than you think." Another left carrying, "Today is a fresh beginning." A young man wearing construction boots smiled after reading, "Someone believes in you even when you forget to believe in yourself." None of the messages were signed. None asked for recognition. Claire simply folded each bag closed and wished everyone a wonderful day. During a quiet moment between customers, Ethan finally asked the question that had been lingering in his mind. "Why do you write something different every single time?" Claire leaned against the counter for a moment, thinking before she answered. "A few years ago, my mother was going through a difficult season. One morning a stranger left her a handwritten note that simply said, 'Keep going. Better days are coming.' She kept that little note in her purse until it almost fell apart. Sometimes people need encouragement more than they need breakfast." Ethan looked toward the marker lying beside the register. Such an ordinary object. Such an extraordinary habit. Without realizing it, he slipped his hand into his backpack and touched the carefully folded bakery bag she had given him on the first day. He had already decided he would never throw it away. Later that afternoon, Claire noticed him watching another customer smile after reading a handwritten message. "Would you like to write one?" she asked, sliding an empty paper bag toward him. Ethan hesitated. He had signed contracts, speeches, and magazine covers, but somehow this felt far more personal. He picked up the marker slowly, stared at the blank paper, and after several quiet seconds wrote just one sentence. "You matter more than you know." Claire read it and smiled warmly. "That is a good one. Someone is going to need those exact words today." Ethan handed the bag back, unaware that he was smiling too. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had done something that would never appear in an annual report, never impress investors, and never increase the value of his companies. Yet it filled him with a satisfaction no financial victory had ever managed to create. As closing time approached, Claire locked the front door and began sweeping the floor while the golden light of sunset stretched across the empty tables. Ethan looked around the little bakery, listening to the comforting silence that followed a busy day. His 30-day experiment had been designed to study other people. Instead, with every passing hour, he was beginning to realize that the person changing the most was himself. By the end of the first week, the bakery no longer felt like a temporary stop-in. Ethan's unusual experiment. It had quietly become the part of each day he anticipated the most. Every morning began before the sun reached the rooftops, with the comforting rhythm of mixing bowls, clattering baking trays, and the rich aroma of fresh coffee filling the small kitchen. Claire always arrived first, unlocking the front door while carrying a canvas tote bag filled with library books she planned to return after work. She never seemed rushed, even though every minute mattered. She greeted the ovens as though they were old friends, tied on her apron, and somehow turned an ordinary workday into something that felt almost peaceful. Ethan found himself learning far more than how to prepare pastries or organize shelves. He was learning how one person's attitude could shape the atmosphere of an entire room. On Saturday afternoon, after the lunch crowd finally slowed, Claire asked if he wanted to take a walk before closing. They carried 2 paper cups of coffee through a nearby neighborhood park where children laughed on the playground while families spread picnic blankets across the grass. The city skyline stood in the distance, its glass towers glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Ethan instinctively glanced toward the tallest building, knowing his office overlooked the entire city from the top floor. Claire noticed him staring. "Beautiful view," she said. Ethan nodded. "Do you ever wish you worked somewhere bigger?" Claire smiled as she watched a little girl struggle to fly a bright yellow kite before her father gently helped it catch the wind. "Not really. Bigger does not always mean better." Ethan looked at her with quiet curiosity. "You have never wanted more?" Claire laughed softly. "Of course I have. Everybody dreams about something. But I learned a long time ago that chasing more can make you forget to appreciate enough." They continued walking until they reached a small public library tucked between rows of brick buildings. Claire stepped inside to return her books, and Ethan followed. Instead of rushing out, she wandered slowly through the shelves, greeting the librarian by name before recommending a novel to an elderly woman searching for something uplifting. Ethan realized she seemed to know almost everyone they encountered. A teenager waved from the study tables. A retired teacher stopped to ask about Claire's mother. Even the security guard smiled when he saw her. None of these people cared how much money she earned. They valued her because she remembered birthdays, checked on neighbors, and treated every conversation as though it mattered. As they left the library, Claire held up another borrowed book. Reading reminds me that every person has a story you cannot see. Ethan quietly absorbed the sentence. It sounded simple, yet it carried more wisdom than many leadership conferences he had attended. Later they walked through a weekend farmer's market where local musicians played cheerful songs while vendors sold homemade jam, flowers, and fresh vegetables. Claire paused at nearly every booth, not because she intended to buy something, but because she genuinely wanted to ask people how their week had been. Ethan watched farmers, artists, and small business owners brighten when she remembered details from conversations weeks earlier. She made people feel important without ever trying. Near the end of the market, they stopped beside a community kitchen where volunteers prepared meals for anyone who needed one. Claire immediately rolled up her sleeves and joined them without hesitation. Ethan followed, serving soup, slicing bread, and handing out meals beside strangers who welcomed him as though he had always belonged there. Nobody asked about his education, his career, or his financial status. They simply worked together until every table was clean and every guest had eaten. Walking back toward the bakery as evening settled across the city, Ethan felt an unfamiliar sense of fulfillment. He had spent years believing influence came from boardrooms, acquisitions, and impressive headlines. Claire was showing him another kind of influence altogether, one measured in quiet conversations, handwritten encouragement, shared meals, and ordinary acts of kindness repeated day after day. That night, after returning to the modest apartment he had rented for his 30-day experiment, Ethan opened his old notebook. He looked at the long list of names written across previous pages, each representing someone who had approached him because of his wealth or reputation. Then, without saying a word, he turned to a blank page and wrote a single sentence instead. Today I finally met someone who sees people before she sees their circumstances. 10 days had passed since Ethan first accepted a cup of coffee from a stranger who expected nothing in return, yet the 30-day experiment he had carefully designed was no longer unfolding according to his plan. Every evening his chief of staff left brief voicemail updates on the prepaid phone he checked only once a day. The board wanted decisions. Investors wanted answers. Reporters were beginning to notice that the usually visible chief executive had disappeared from public events. Ethan listened to each message in silence before placing the phone back inside his backpack. For the first time in years, the urgent demands of his business no longer felt more important than the quiet conversations waiting for him each morning inside the neighborhood bakery. Claire noticed that he seemed distracted one afternoon while they organized shelves after the lunch rush. She did not ask where he had been before arriving in the neighborhood. She did not ask why someone with so few belongings sometimes carried himself with surprising confidence. Instead, she simply handed him a fresh loaf of sourdough and smiled. "You are thinking too much again." Ethan looked up, slightly amused. "Is it that obvious?" Claire nodded. "People carry heavy thoughts the same way they carry heavy boxes. Eventually, you can see it on their face." Ethan laughed softly. "Do you always know exactly what to say?" She shook her head. "Not at all. I just know that everybody is fighting something you cannot see." Her answer stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. Later that evening, as they locked the bakery together, Claire suggested taking a different route home. Instead of heading directly toward the bus stop, she walked several blocks to a small community garden tucked between apartment buildings. Tomatoes, herbs, and colorful flowers filled raised wooden beds cared for by neighborhood volunteers. Claire greeted several older gardeners by name before kneeling to pull a few weeds from one corner without being asked. Ethan joined her, still wearing the bakery apron tied loosely around his waist. "You volunteer here too?" he asked. Claire smiled without looking up. Sometimes people think helping has to be something extraordinary. Most of the time it is just showing up where somebody needs another pair of hands. As they worked, an elderly man thanked Claire for bringing fresh bread every Friday to residents who could not easily leave their apartments. Ethan looked at her with quiet surprise. She had never mentioned any of it. She simply shrugged after the man walked away. They spent their whole lives taking care of other people. It feels right that someone remembers them now. Ethan realized there was a pattern to everything she did. She never helped because someone was watching. She helped because she believed kindness was supposed to become a habit rather than an event. That realization made his own accomplishments suddenly feel incomplete. He had donated millions of dollars through corporate foundations, but almost every gift had involved meetings, announcements, cameras, or carefully prepared press releases. Claire's generosity rarely cost much money, yet it transformed every room she entered. The following morning, while preparing the display case before opening, Ethan noticed Claire quietly placing 2 breakfast bags on the Help Yourself shelf. Each bag carried another handwritten message. One read, "You are never alone, even if today feels lonely." The other simply said, "Tomorrow can surprise you in beautiful ways." Ethan watched her cap the marker and place it back beside the register. "Do you ever worry that people will take advantage of your kindness?" he asked. Claire paused for a moment before answering. "Maybe a few will. But I would rather be disappointed once in a while than become the kind of person who stops believing in people." Her words settled into the silence between them. Ethan looked toward the front window where the city was beginning another busy morning. His notebook still contained pages filled with memories of betrayal, disappointment, and carefully documented reasons never to trust too easily again. Yet standing beside Claire, those pages seemed to belong to someone he barely recognized. At that exact moment, the prepaid phone inside his backpack began vibrating again. The screen displayed the name of his chief of staff for the 6th time that week. Ethan looked at the call, then slipped the phone back into his bag without answering. For the first time since building his empire, he consciously chose a simple morning in a neighborhood bakery over the powerful world that had always expected him to return. The second week of Ethan's self-imposed disappearance began with an unexpected invitation that changed the rhythm of every day that followed. Early Monday morning, just after the first wave of commuters had collected their coffee and pastries, Claire wiped flour from her hands and looked at him with an encouraging smile. "The community kitchen is serving dinner again tonight. They could use extra volunteers if you are interested." Ethan answered without hesitation. "I will be there." By the time the evening sun painted the brick buildings in warm shades of gold, they were standing side by side in the familiar neighborhood center, tying simple aprons over their clothes and preparing vegetables alongside retirees, college students, and parents who had come straight from work. Nobody asked where Ethan had come from or why he had arrived. They simply handed him a cutting board and welcomed him into the routine as though he had always belonged there. As the meal service began, Ethan carried trays from table to table, greeting guests with the same quiet respect Claire showed everyone she met. He noticed that she remembered names effortlessly. She asked one elderly woman about her grandson's baseball tournament, congratulated another volunteer for passing a nursing exam, and reminded a young father that the library was hosting a free family reading event the following Saturday. Every conversation left someone smiling. Watching her, Ethan understood something he had overlooked for years. Leadership was not measured only by the number of people who reported to you. Sometimes it was measured by how many people felt valued after spending just a few moments in your presence. On the walk back toward the bakery, the city lights reflected across rain-soaked sidewalks after a brief afternoon shower. Claire carried an empty basket that had been filled with fresh rolls only hours earlier. "Can I ask you something?" she said gently. Ethan nodded. "Of course." She glanced ahead before speaking. "You always listen more than you talk. It feels like you are carrying a life you never mention. You do not have to tell me anything, but I hope whatever happened before you came here does not stop you from believing your future can be different." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle quietly in his heart. She had come closer to understanding him than anyone else without asking for explanations or demanding details. He smiled gratefully. "Thank you." Claire returned the smile. "Sometimes that is enough." The following morning, the bakery owner, Mr. Harris, gathered the small staff before opening. His expression carried a concern Ethan had not seen before. He explained that business had slowed during the past several months, while operating costs continued climbing. The lease renewal would arrive soon, and nobody knew whether the rent would remain affordable. Claire listened calmly, but Ethan noticed the brief shadow that crossed her face. She cared about this place far beyond the paycheck it provided. It was part of the neighborhood, part of her daily purpose, and part of the lives of countless customers who depended on its welcoming atmosphere. Throughout the day, she never allowed her worries to affect the people walking through the front door. Every paper bag still received a handwritten message. Every customer still received the same sincere smile. Late that afternoon, after the last order had been served, Ethan remained behind to wipe tables while Claire balanced the register. A folded envelope slipped from beneath a stack of receipts and landed on the floor. She quickly picked it up before he could read the contents, but not before he noticed the logo of a local hospital printed across the corner. She quietly placed it back into her bag without saying a word. Ethan did not ask about it. He remembered her belief that every person carried a story invisible to everyone else. If she wished to share it someday, she would. As they prepared to lock the bakery, Claire handed him another empty paper bag and slid the familiar black marker across the counter. "Your turn again," she said. Ethan looked at the blank paper for a long moment before writing carefully in steady letters. The smallest act of kindness can become the beginning of someone else's new life. Claire read the sentence, nodded with quiet approval, and placed the bag on the help yourself shelf. Neither of them noticed a well-dressed man standing across the street inside a black sedan, lowering his phone after taking a photograph of Ethan through the bakery window. After searching for his missing chief executive for nearly 2 weeks, the first member of Ethan's corporate world had finally found him. The photograph reached Ethan's chief of staff before sunrise the next morning. Within an hour, half a dozen executives knew exactly where the missing chief executive had been spending his days. Calls, emails, and urgent messages flooded the prepaid phone resting inside Ethan's backpack, but he left it untouched while arranging fresh croissants beside Claire before the bakery opened. The familiar routine had become something he quietly protected. The sound of the oven timer, the smell of warm bread, and Claire's cheerful greeting to every customer felt more real than the polished conference rooms he had left behind. Just after the morning rush ended, the bakery door opened again. A sharply dressed man stepped inside wearing a navy suit that looked completely out of place among flour-covered aprons and wooden display cases. Ethan recognized him immediately. It was Daniel Brooks, his chief of staff. Daniel's eyes widened for a brief moment before he regained his professional composure. Claire approached with her usual welcoming smile. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" Daniel glanced at Ethan before answering. "Just a black coffee, please." Claire prepared the drink while Ethan quietly walked toward the back storage room. Daniel followed a few seconds later. The moment the door closed, he lowered his voice. "Everyone has been looking for you. The board has scheduled emergency meetings every other day. Investors are asking questions. Reporters are creating their own stories because nobody knows where you are." Ethan remained calm. "How did you find me?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Someone recognized you yesterday. The photograph reached corporate headquarters last night." Ethan nodded slowly, unsurprised. He had always known the outside world would eventually catch up with him. "I need 1 more week," he said quietly. Daniel looked genuinely puzzled. "1 more week for what?" Ethan glanced through the small window in the storage room door. Claire was laughing with a young customer while carefully writing another encouraging message on a bakery bag. "To remember the kind of man I wanted to become before I became the man everyone expected." Daniel followed his gaze. For the first time since working together, he saw something different in Ethan's expression. The constant pressure, guarded confidence, and relentless urgency had been replaced by a calm he had never witnessed inside any boardroom. Daniel sighed. "You know they will not understand." Ethan smiled gently. "I am beginning to realize that not everyone has to." Before leaving, Daniel handed Ethan a sealed envelope. "At least read this. It cannot wait forever." Ethan slipped it into his backpack without opening it. When they returned to the front of the bakery, Claire simply smiled at Daniel and wished him a wonderful day, never suspecting she had just served coffee to one of the highest-ranking executives in a multi-billion-dollar corporation. After Daniel departed, Claire tilted her head curiously. Was he an old friend? Ethan paused before answering. "Someone from my previous life." Claire accepted the explanation without another question. Instead, she handed him a fresh paper bag and pointed toward the familiar black marker. "Then maybe somebody today needs one of your messages." Ethan smiled as he wrote carefully across the front of the bag. "The people who truly matter will never ask you to pretend to be someone else." Claire read the words and looked at him thoughtfully. "That sounds personal." Ethan laughed softly. Maybe it is. The afternoon passed peacefully until Mr. Harris called the staff together once more. His expression was heavier than before. He explained that the building owner had requested a meeting later that week regarding the lease, and he feared the rent would increase beyond what the bakery could afford. Silence settled over the room. Claire looked around at the worn wooden tables, the faded photographs on the walls, and the help-yourself shelf that had quietly served the neighborhood for years. "We will figure something out," she said with gentle confidence, encouraging everyone else before thinking of herself. Ethan watched her once again, placing hope into the hearts of other people while carrying worries she rarely shared. As they closed the bakery that evening, he noticed Claire lingering beside the front window for a moment longer than usual, looking out at the quiet street with thoughtful eyes. She finally smiled and turned off the lights, but Ethan understood that behind her calm expression, she was afraid of losing a place that meant far more than a simple job. Standing alone outside after she walked toward the bus stop, Ethan reached into his backpack and unfolded the sealed envelope Daniel had delivered. Across the top of the first page, in bold letters, were the words "Notice of Emergency Board Meeting." The meeting was scheduled for the very same day as the bakery owner's appointment with the landlord, and for the first time since beginning his 30-day journey, Ethan realized he would soon have to choose which world needed him more. The morning of the two meetings arrived beneath a gray Chicago sky that matched the uncertainty weighing on Ethan's mind. By 8 o'clock, the bakery was already busy with regular customers, yet he found it difficult to focus on arranging pastries or filling coffee cups. Folded neatly inside his backpack was the notice for the emergency board meeting that could determine the future direction of Walker Dynamics. At almost the same hour, Mr. Harris would be meeting with the building owner to learn whether the bakery could afford to remain in the neighborhood it had served for decades. Two worlds waited for him. One had built his fortune. The other had quietly rebuilt his character. Claire noticed the distraction in his eyes before the morning rush had even ended. She placed a warm cinnamon roll beside him and smiled with the same gentle confidence that had greeted him every day since they met. "Whatever decision you are carrying today," she said softly, "do not choose the one that only looks important. Choose the one that lets you sleep peacefully tonight." Ethan looked at her with genuine surprise. "How do you always know when something is wrong?" Claire laughed quietly. "I do not. I just know that people usually become quieter before they make difficult decisions." Her words settled deeply inside him. For years he had believed success came from making the smartest decision. Claire reminded him that sometimes the right decision was the one that protected people instead of appearances. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Mr. Harris straightened his tie and prepared to leave for the meeting with the landlord. He tried to sound optimistic, but nobody inside the bakery missed the concern behind his smile. Claire wished him good luck before returning to the counter to help customers as though nothing unusual was happening. Ethan checked the time on the prepaid phone. The emergency board meeting would begin in less than 30 minutes across the city. Daniel had already sent several messages asking whether he planned to attend. Ethan quietly switched the phone off. An hour passed. The bakery remained busy while everyone waited for news. Finally, the front door opened. Mr. Harris stepped inside, carrying a thin folder beneath his arm. His shoulders slumped before he spoke a single word. The room became silent. "The rent is increasing by nearly 50%, he said quietly. "I have tried everything, but there is no way we can keep operating here beyond the end of next month." Nobody spoke. Claire looked around the familiar bakery with glistening eyes, taking in the wooden shelves, the handwritten menu, the help-yourself shelf, and the tables where generations of neighbors had gathered over coffee and fresh bread. She took a slow breath before forcing a hopeful smile. "Then we make the best of the time we have left," she said gently. This place has always been more than four walls. Even while facing disappointment, she was comforting everyone else. Ethan felt something shift inside him. He finally understood why the experiment had changed him so completely. Claire never measured the value of a place by what it earned. She measured it by the lives it touched. Without another word, Ethan stepped outside onto the quiet sidewalk and walked several yards away before turning his prepaid phone back on. Within seconds, it began ringing. Daniel answered before the first ring had fully ended. "Where are you?" Ethan looked back through the bakery window where Claire was still serving customers with the same sincere smile, despite the uncertain future hanging over the little shop. "I am exactly where I need to be," he answered calmly. Daniel exhaled with relief. The board meeting has been delayed because everyone refused to begin without you. Ethan spoke with quiet confidence, unlike anything Daniel had heard before. Cancel the rest of my schedule today. Prepare the legal department, the real estate division, and the community investment team. I want every ownership record for this building, every neighboring property, and every available lease agreement on my desk within 2 hours. Daniel fell silent for a moment. Are you returning to headquarters? Ethan smiled as he watched Claire place another handwritten message on a bakery bag for a customer who would never know how much hope those simple words carried. No, he replied. Headquarters is coming to me. The next morning began unlike any other since Ethan had walked into the bakery wearing worn sneakers and carrying nothing but a backpack. Before sunrise, several black luxury vehicles rolled quietly onto the street and stopped across from the little corner shop. Men and women in tailored business suits stepped onto the sidewalk carrying briefcases, tablets, and folders stamped with the Walker Dynamics logo. Curious neighbors slowed their morning walks. Regular customers paused outside the bakery windows. Inside, Claire looked up from arranging fresh muffins and frowned with quiet confusion. I wonder who they are waiting for, she said. Ethan smiled gently, but did not answer. A moment later, the front door opened, and Daniel Brooks entered with several senior executives following close behind. The entire bakery fell silent. Instead of approaching the counter, Daniel walked directly toward Ethan. Without hesitation, every executive stopped in front of him. Good morning, Mr. Walker, Daniel said respectfully. The legal team has completed everything you requested. Claire froze where she stood, still holding the black marker she used to write encouragement on every bakery bag. Mr. Harris stared in disbelief. None of the employees spoke a single word. Ethan slowly untied the familiar bakery apron and folded it with the same care he had shown on his very first day. He turned toward Claire, whose expression carried more surprise than anger. I owe you the truth, he said quietly. My name is Ethan Walker. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Walker Dynamics. The room remained perfectly still. Claire searched his face, remembering every early morning, every shared cup of coffee, every walk through the neighborhood, and every conversation that had seemed so ordinary. You were never looking for a job, she whispered. Ethan gently shook his head. No, I was looking for something much harder to find. He reached into his backpack and carefully removed the folded bakery bag she had handed him on the first morning they met. The paper was slightly worn from being opened so many times, but the handwritten message remained clear. Kindness feeds the soul before it feeds the body. This, Ethan said as he held up the bag, is worth more to me than anything I signed in my office over the last 10 years. You gave it to someone you believed had nothing. You expected nothing in return. You reminded me who I wanted to become long before I ever built a company. Claire's eyes filled with emotion, but she remained silent. Daniel stepped forward and handed Ethan a leather folder. Ethan signed several documents before passing them directly to Mr. Harris. The bakery owner opened the folder with trembling hands. His eyes widened as he reached the final page. This cannot be real, he whispered. Ethan smiled warmly. It is. Effective today, the building belongs to a community trust established by Walker Dynamics. The bakery will remain here permanently. The rent will never increase beyond what a neighborhood business can reasonably afford. The help yourself shelf will always stay exactly where it is. Tears quietly filled Mr. Harris's eyes as he looked around the little bakery that had suddenly been given a future again. Ethan turned back toward Claire. There is one more thing. He explained that he had also created a new nationwide initiative called Community Kitchens, designed to support independent neighborhood bakeries, food programs, and local volunteers across the country. Every location would display the same handwritten belief that had changed his life. Kindness feeds the soul before it feeds the body. Claire smiled through quiet tears. You really kept the paper bag. Ethan laughed softly. I kept every reminder that taught me what success actually looks like. 1 year later, the neighborhood had changed in ways nobody could have imagined. The bakery was thriving. The community kitchen served more families than ever before, and dozens of new community kitchens had opened across the United States. Inside Ethan's office, surrounded by awards and framed business achievements, the most valuable item on the wall was not a certificate or a photograph. It was a simple bakery bag with a handwritten message from an ordinary morning that had transformed an extraordinary life. Standing beside him during the dedication ceremony for the newest community center, Claire smiled as children and families filled the building with laughter. Ethan reached into his jacket and unfolded the faded paper bag one final time before carefully placing it into a glass display case. "The world believed wealth changed my life," he said quietly. "The truth is that kindness did." Claire slipped her hand into his, and together they watched another customer leave the bakery carrying fresh bread and a handwritten message, proving once again that the smallest act of compassion could travel farther than anyone would ever know.